Welcome to Pretty Lies and Alibis. Let's seek the truth and travel the long road to justice together. What you know, Alibiers. Welcome to another episode of Pretty Lies and Alibis. I'm Gigi, day 16 in the Lori Vallow murder trial. Music fact of the day: Janis Joplin was at a party once with Jim Morrison, and Jim Morrison was hitting on her. And after she refused his advances like 1,000 times, he kept persisting. So what did she do? She broke a bottle of Southern Comfort over his head, knocked him out. But later on, he still said she was a great woman. You go, Janis. All right, we're going to jump in because I've got a crazy night, super busy, crazy. Tomorrow and Friday, I will not have episodes out until Saturday, because I'm taking a red eye out of here. Friday, I'm going to be traveling to Atlanta and back with no sleep. So I apologize in advance, but Saturday we'll get you guys all caught up. Let's start with this morning. We picked back up with FBI agent Daniels, and we were talking about that search warrant on Chad's property. And they called JJ's burial site number 1. That was actually the first grave they dug up. And they show an overall photo showing the burial site before any excavation had taken place. They show the marked off area where they will dig. And then they took Faro scans before any work started to show that excavation from start to finish. So they show a series of photos. The first one was a top layer of that vegetation removed, showing what you can see as the white rocks just underneath that dirt. The rocks were placed in a very precise way, and you could see that roots were cut from the tree that is nearby. And they asked the FBI agent, "Did you guys cut the roots?" And he said no. So clearly, who I would assume to be professional grave digger Chad did. And then they show that wood paneling that was underneath the rocks. We heard just last week they found paneling similar to that on Chad's property. He said out of all the burials he's ever worked, this one has been the most precise as far as the grave goes. And that's where Chad, being a grave digger, comes in. So the rocks and the paneling could have been put there to keep wildlife away. As decomposition occurs, it could cause the grave to sink. And that also could have been a reason the rocks and the paneling were put there. The next photo, they have removed those wooden panels, and the team excavates further, showing the round part of JJ's, what we know to be JJ's head, in that black garbage bag. By the way, trigger warning: if you're sensitive to crimes, especially involving children, this is not the episode for you. And I completely understand if you need to tune out this one, because the most of the day was the medical examiner and it got very graphic. Then the next photo also was the crown of the head exposed through the dirt. Next photo, under the plastic bag, as we know, was a white plastic bag. They cut into that there at the scene just to get down to verify these were human remains. The hair came out when he cut through that white bag, and then they knew that those were human remains. The next photo is a close-up showing that cut in the bag with hair poking out, and you can also start to see some of that duct tape. They sifted dirt around the body to make sure they weren't missing any evidence that was in the ground. Then just some progression photos of excavating the grave where JJ was found. In this picture, you can see the garbage bags covering his body, but it's still partially covered by dirt. The next photo was an overhead photo showing more of that garbage bag, and then the duct tape you could see clearly. The next photo was an overhead of the body, completely excavated and ready to be removed from the ground. The next photo showed an empty grave and how the soil looked different due to the decomposition that had taken place and that had went underneath his body. The next photo was a blue tent in the background and a tarp with rocks and wood paneling laying on there, and those were taken as evidence. The next photo was a long shot of that hole that they had dug, and it was deep. It was very deep. And the reason they went deeper and wider with excavating his grave is because at that point, they had not found Tylee's remains. They thought something might be over in the fire pit area, but they didn't know. Was she buried underneath JJ? Was she near him? So that's why they did such a wide area with him. Nothing else was found at that burial site. We know they used the Faro scanner at that burial site, and we see a diagram that shows the depth of where everything was was found. It's really cool because, like, on the right-hand side of the screen, they have layer A, and it has all the photos showing what was found under layer A. Then at the bottom, you kind of have this color-coded chart that shows your different depth levels of where they found things. The rocks and the paneling were about a foot underground, and JJ's remains were just above 2 feet in the dirt. Now, in Chad's book, 1 Foot in the Grave or whatever, I read it just a few weeks ago. He said you only need 2 feet from where the vault, if you're doing a normal burial, to where the grass is. So it kind of looks like that's the same method he used here. There was some ERT photos from the search warrant June 9th and 10th when they found the bodies. There was an objection, but it was overruled. They said it was the same photos. There were differences, and JJ's burial was different with the stones and planks, as well as JJ's remains being intact and wrapped. So with Tylee, they couldn't tell at first if they were even human remains or animal remains. They talk about that mass of organic material that they tried to lift out, but it eventually just fell to pieces when they did. It's just horrific. It is so hard to look at this screen and see the videos and pictures of JJ and Tylee and these beautiful souls that they were, and then see this, the end, how it ended for them. I can't describe it, y'all. I've seen a lot of crime scene photos. I'm going to tell you, these are about the worst. And I'm not saying that because this case is close to my heart. It is about the worst I've ever seen. Also, with Tylee being dismembered and burned, it was very different. But you go back to Zulima's testimony. What are some ways you prevent a zombie from getting back into a body? If we're going this, I don't even like to call it religious beliefs, this stupid stuff they thought. You burn the body or you bind the body. Well, Tylee was burned and JJ was bound. So Mr. Thomas was up for cross, and really it's just him questioning the experience of the witnesses. That's all it is. He's not refuting anything they say about any of this. There's not really anything. Well, Lori, the main thing they've said, Lori was in Hawaii when Tammy Daybell was killed. That's kind of the only thing that they've done, but they have their strategy. And I think they're probably just happy that death is off the table. He asked the witness would he consider this case 1 or 2 burials. And the witness says 2 because of the contrast that he just described, which is the bodies were found in 2 very different conditions in 2 different locations. He asks if he's done a burial in Idaho besides this one. And he said, this is to determine his credibility. And the witness says, I believe so. I would need to check. He thinks it was on a reservation somewhere. So Mr. Thomas says, you cover Idaho, Utah, Montana. Where in Montana would you have gone? And the witness says that he really didn't want to say the location. Mr. Thomas asks how they determine the grid that they mark off as an area to search. And the witness said they created their own grid and sifted through each area. Mr. Thomas asks about the fire pit area and asks if the fire circle itself was one grid, and he said yes. Lori was watching Mr. Thomas, by the way, very intently as he cross-examined this witness. So Mr. Thomas asks about him being the senior leader of the ERT team, and the witness says he's over all ERT members in Idaho, Montana, and Utah. He's asked if he has met with other senior leaders across the country, and he said no. But he did talk to the evidence response unit in Fredericksburg, Virginia, specifically about this case. So that was the end of cross, and the defense was finished with him, but out of precaution, they did not release him from his subpoena. So next, the state calls Dr. Garth Warren, a forensic pathologist. This is where we're going to get pretty graphic. Ada County has contracts with Fremont and Madison counties to perform autopsies. So once he receives the body, he takes note of the clothing, any possessions on the person, anything that needs to be taken for evidence. And he explains how they do the autopsy, from toxicology to looking for outward signs of injury before they do the internal exam. He did JJ's autopsy on June 11th, 2020 at the Ada County morgue. That took about 4 hours to complete. Now, we learned today, as we kind of all suspected, his cause of death was asphyxia due to that plastic bag being over his head and duct taped. He also had duct tape over his mouth. So with JJ, the body was in a sealed bag. He said the body was wrapped in what he called a black tarp, sealed with duct tape. He saw a white plastic bag over JJ's head wrapped around the face multiple times. and sealed with duct tape to the neck. Now, JJ had on those red PJs in that last photo we saw of him that was taken the last morning he was alive. He had on black socks. The PJs had decomposition and mold on them. All the things on the body, the clothes, the duct tape, all that was submitted to law enforcement. The bag that was on his head was cut off very, very carefully. Duct tape from the face, the arms, the ankles. They took fingernail clippings, hand swabs, did all kinds of tests to determine. They also made sure that this was not a sexually motivated crime. And they also pulled some of his hair out to be tested and a portion of the rib and 2 molars for DNA comparison. On the external exam, there was decomposition, discoloration. One injury was an abrasion on the left side of JJ's neck. And considering how he was found, any injury to the neck is a red flag to the medical examiner. And really, the assumption is that JJ was struggling to get this bag off of his head, and he had some scratches on his neck. It's just terrible. He also had bruising on both upper arms. So to me, it almost makes me think somebody was holding him down very hard. It's clear JJ fought until he took his last breath, and they found evidence of defensive wounds. After the autopsy was complete, they gathered tissue from organs to look at under the microscope. And due to decomposition, there was no blood or urine for toxicology, so they sent a sample of his liver. They did full body x-rays. Those were clear. There were no fractures or abnormalities. Now, the toxicology report was interesting. He had low levels of ethanol, which is part of decomposition, and then he had GHB, which is a drug used to treat narcolepsy. And at one time, it was an anesthetic. It's also known as liquid ecstasy or date rape drug that renders you unconscious. Now, GHB is naturally found in the human body. The amount in JJ's body was inconclusive. It can be found in the liver post-mortem. So that was the sample they sent off. So he can't tell if this is just a natural part of decomposition or if JJ was drugged. And with the defensive wounds, it does not seem like he was drugged, unfortunately. Now, we got to a point to where they were going to show photos of this autopsy, and Mr. Thomas objected and asked first if they could be shown in black and white. So they go and have this sidebar. He said it was prejudicial. So Judge Boyce decides ultimately that us sitting in the room could not see the photos, only the jury and defense and the prosecution tables. And so cops were placed to where I guess they were making sure we weren't trying to look over in the jury box. Lori was talking to her attorneys during this part, and Lori started wiping tears as those photos start being shown. She looked at the defense monitor a couple of times at JJ's pictures. So she grabbed 2 tissues, by the way, 2, I counted. He had bruising on the upper arms. They were symmetric. So that's why I think he was being held down. Now, she had her face propped on her hand with a tissue in her hand. Her face was red. One female juror was wiping her eyes with a tissue. I saw a couple that just really glanced away quickly. The bruising on the arms was determined to have been caused before death. He could tell because he made an incision just underneath the skin. And when there's hemorrhage just underneath that subcutaneous area right there, and there's blood, you know that happened when they were alive because there's no circulation when you're dead. The abrasions aren't decomposition according to the medical examiner. If it's post-mortem, this is the scratches on the neck, by the way, they have a yellow waxy appearance and there's rarely a hemorrhage. The ones on JJ's neck were tan, brown, kind of red, with hemorrhage. So those came while he was alive. He was also involved in the autopsy for Tylee. It took place on the same day as JJ's, which was June 11th of 2020 at the Ada County Coroner's office. So normally he gets an entire body and he has a process that he goes through with each body he receives. But unfortunately, Tylee's remains were received in 3 separate sealed bags, 2 body bags and 1 large paper bag that inside that large paper bag had 5 other paper bags in there with bone fragments. This autopsy lasted a lot longer due to the process of identifying what bones there were, cleaning the bones for the anthropologist, removing soft tissue, x-rays. It took them about a week to do Tylee's autopsy. So in the x-ray, you try to see what bones you do have. Are there any foreign objects such as projectiles? They didn't find any projectiles, any pieces of metal that would indicate like a broken knife or anything like that. They saw collections of bones and a lot of debris on the remains, such as mud and dirt. They did do toxicology by using skeletal muscles, and there were large pieces of muscle, so he was able to get a sample for that. So for Tylee's toxicology, she was positive for ibuprofen and carbon monoxide and iron. Carbon monoxide level was extremely low, and they were able to determine that when her remains were burned, she was not alive. Trigger warning, we're about to get really graphic here. They found Tylee's heart still connected to her lungs, one kidney, a few small segments of bowel, portions of the liver, and small fragments of brain matter. They all had severe decomposition and were shrunken from having been burned. They found her pelvis with one portion of the femur attached, portions of her skull, which was the superior portion, like up here, your upper skull, and that they had the beginnings of the eye orbit, which is where your eyeball goes into your skull. Fragments of skull, jawbone. There were some teeth intact. We did see that photo. Multiple vertebrae, both of her collarbones, tibia and fibula, radius and ulna, part of her sternum. And so these weren't clean bones. They were blackened and charred by fire, damage due to the dismemberment process, which we'll get to in a minute. This is not a typical dismemberment by no means. But ultimately, as we kind of figured during jury selection when they were asking them, can you convict without a cause of death? Her cause of death was deemed homicide by unspecified means, meaning they just could not figure out how she was killed. The criteria for reaching homicide by unspecified means, how did they come up with that? What's kind of the elimination process? Objectively specific circumstances. Her body was dismembered, burned, buried out of sight. No findings at autopsy to determine a cause of death. Not enough of the body to determine a cause of death, and toxicology being negative. So Tylee fit all those criteria in that it was clear she was murdered, just we don't know how. There was no medical explanation from medical or social records that he obtained, and he reviewed her medical records, and none of the conditions that she had would have caused her death. And I'm not going to get into the conditions that she had when she was alive. So when he sent the muscle off for toxicology, he collected multiple pieces of soft tissue, liver, and other organs for potential DNA analysis. There was a strand of hair in one of the bags with her remains, and that was also submitted. In the bag was that melted green bucket, and that was given to law enforcement for testing. Some of the photos were not shown on the projector for Tylee, but a lot were. Lori had her head down. She wasn't looking. And so the medical examiner starts pointing out all the different body parts that are in the photo. Mr. Thomas was up for cross-exam. He's asking about his experience, and he says about 10% of the yearly autopsies he does are homicides or suspicious deaths. Mr. Thomas mentions he has a contract with Madison and Fremont counties and asks if he is trained in the collection of trace evidence. Most of the like I said, the whole trial has just been questioning like the credibility of the witnesses. He asks who all was in the room when her autopsy was done. There were 3 autopsy techs from Ada County, prosecutor Rob Wood, 2 Rexburg detectives, Fremont County coroner, and somebody in the FBI. Mr. Thomas asks who was responsible for collecting trace evidence off the body, and the witness says he is. On the scene, it would be law enforcement. He asked if the prosecutor suggested things to get from that autopsy, and the witness said it can be a collective effort if law enforcement is attending an autopsy, but there are standard things they do with each case that it doesn't matter if law enforcement says we don't need that or whatever, it's going to get done. Law enforcement may say, I need this, this, and this, and typically they'll try to honor that. So then Mr. Thomas asks specifically, who asked for what in this case? And the witness says, look, it's been 3 years. I don't remember. Mr. Thomas asked, was the autopsy recorded? And he said no. So Mr. Thomas says you have no specific recollection about conversations you had about what to collect. And the witness said, that's right. Mr. Thomas says a lot of theories were out there. And what made you determine what you did with the cause of death for JJ? He said he got a timeline of what they knew at that point about the case from law enforcement. He said, I determined the cause of death due to the plastic bag being over his head that was duct tape. Americans spend an average of 90% of their time indoors. According to the EPA, indoor air could be 2 to 5 times more polluted than outdoor air. And in some cases, it could be 100 times more polluted. We take about 20,000 breaths per day. That's almost 3 gallons of possibly polluted air. Airborne allergens are the most common allergy triggers, such as pollen, pet dander, dust mites, and mold. Look, I love my animals, but they make me sneeze. But since I've been using Air Doctor, I don't have to take my allergy medicines, and I see a huge decrease in the amount of dust in my house. That's a win-win. What's the solution? Air Doctor filters out dangerous contaminants and allergens so your lungs don't have to. Air Doctor uses an ultra HEPA filter that's been independently tested to remove 99.99% of tested bacteria and viruses. The classic Air Doctor 3000 purifier is powerful enough to circulate the air in a 630 plus square foot room 4 times per hour. And the Whisper Jet fans are 30% quieter than the fans in ordinary air purifiers. So, Air Doctor comes with a no questions asked 30-day money-back guarantee. So if you don't love it, just send it back for a refund minus shipping. So head to airdoctorpro.com and use promo code WhatTheWorld. And depending on the model, you'll receive up to 39% off. Let me tell you all about our sponsor of the week, Pros. There's no one-size-fits-all solution when it comes to hair care, and that's because your hair and your hair goals are completely unique. My hair is dry and frizzy. I wanted to get rid of these problems. Thanks to my personalized Pros routine, I can honestly say I've never been in more love with my hair. First, Pros asked me for my hair goals, which was smoother hair with color protection. Their in-depth consultation also asks about you as a person. Pros ask me really unexpected things like my age, hair length, do I get split ends, and even my zip code, so that Pros can factor in the environment my hair lives in. Next, Pros analyzed all my answers and handpicked clean ingredients to help me reach my hair goals. I use the Scalp Remedy, Clarify and Cleanse Color Extending Shampoo, and the Smoothing Solution Volume Building Conditioner. I also use the Boar's Hairbrush that makes my hair super smooth. My hair is completely different. The frizz is gone and it's so much softer. All their ingredients are sustainably sourced, ethically gathered, and cruelty-free. They're also the first custom beauty brand to go carbon neutral. If you're not 100% positive Pros is the best care hair you've had, they will take the products back, no questions asked. Pros is the key to achieving all your hair goals this year. Take your free in-depth hair consultation and get 15% off your first order today. Go to pros.com/whattheworld. That's pros, PROSE.com/whattheworld for your free in-depth hair consultation and 15% off. So then he's asked if he swabbed JJ's sinuses, and he said no. Did you swab the throat? He said yes. Any evidence of microplastics in there? The witness said they wouldn't find that with the bag over the head. And Mr. Thomas says, so how do you conclude he was smothered with a plastic bag? He said, well, there was evidence of a struggle. There's a plastic bag over his head that was duct taped. Thomas says that could have been put over his head after death. And the witness says, I guess that's possible. The witness says, if you have a person with a plastic bag taped over his head and the autopsy shows nothing else, you would assume it was asphyxia. Mr. Thomas asked again if they swabbed the sinuses, and he said, I've never heard of anyone doing that. Mr. Thomas says he's just going off what he has seen in movies. And get this, the witness says, that's scary. He says, I'm going off what I know. And we were all like, ooh. So Mr. Thomas he's just throwing out all kinds of theories. None of them make much sense. And he tells the medical examiner that they'll just have to disagree. And the witness says, I guess we will. So Mr. Thomas says, you put JJ on his belly. Did you get any trace evidence from his backside? And the witness said that they got swabs from private areas to make sure this was not a sexually motivated crime. He talks about the bruising on JJ's arms, asking if they're prior to his death. How can you tell? This was prior to the death, and the witness says you can't date a bruise, but he said it was red and purple, and a healing bruise would have a different color. Mr. Thomas says fresh as within days, and the witness says no, too far out, right around the time of death. Clearly there was a struggle. So we had our last witness of the day, Dr. Angie Christensen. She's a forensic anthropologist for the FBI, and she's out of Quantico, Virginia. That's a specialized field that examines the human skeleton, and they can't determine cause and manner of death. They'll send bones to forensic anthropologists to see if they can determine maybe a cause of death. They also start with a visual assessment, which bones are there, the condition of the bones. They'll look at the bones under a microscope. They'll take x-rays. And the Ada County coroner requested the help of the FBI in this case. And so she took measurements, looked through microscopes, and did a CT scan of the bones that they had. She got 100 plus bones sent to her to analyze. And some of the bones still had soft tissue attached. All major parts of the skeleton were represented. And one thing that surprised me about Tylee was that really from what I'd heard before the trial, I didn't think there was going to be very much of her left, but there was a lot. There were organs, there were bones, there were major bones. And her observations of Tylee's remains was fragmented for the most part. The bones were thermally altered. They had been burned, and 3 bones had sharp trauma produced by a tool. And some of the bones were hinged or bent. That could happen before death or after. Fire can cause bones to bend. The hinged or bent bone happened at or around the time of death, according to the doctor. Thermal damage could make the bone more brittle, which would make it bend or break. But burning a bone changes the color. It goes from a creamy color to a tan, then black, and then eventually like really white. It also causes that bone to fracture more easily. Knee and elbows that have little tissue and fat protection tend to burn more. So anything that's kind of buried between a layer of fat and muscle, it takes a while for those bones to burn. But we don't have much here on the elbows and knees. She said on the photo that was shown, there are arrows. So of course, Mr. Thomas wanted to know what these arrows were. Well, it's just sharp marks in these bones. One bone had been chewed on by animals. I believe that was a femur, one of her leg bones, by the way. Lori has her head down. She's just writing on her legal pad. She did look up at the screen for a split second as I was typing this. I have this in my notes. Photo of 3 parts of the skull. We can see teeth are still intact, and she's pointing out the thermal damage on these bones. She removed the remaining soft tissue so that she could do a thorough examination. And she can't see any damage through soft tissue, so it has to be removed. And at that point, they had gotten all they needed for DNA. She's explaining the types of trauma that she has seen on bones in the past. You have blunt trauma, sharp trauma, or high velocity projectile trauma. With Tylee's remains, she found sharp trauma on 3 bones, the left and the right hip bones, and the bottom of the spine or the sacrum. The tool mark had a beveled edge or point, so sharp trauma. The left pelvic bone, she had arrows pointing to the sharp tool marks on the front and back of the bone, and she identified 5 sharp traumas on that left pelvic bone. What's odd about this is dismemberment typically occurs around the joints. With the current photo she's showing, she says this is not typical of dismemberment. She can't say what action or implement caused it because they aren't near joints. This is in the pelvic region. So I was talking to Joseph Scott Morgan after court today, and he's wonderful. Body Bags, if you don't listen to his podcast, please go check it out. If you love forensics, that's your dude. But we were talking about how this is not typical. And it's almost like if you could picture, and I hate to be graphic, her laying on her back and being struck with something. Now we know they took some shovels and a pickaxe for analysis. Now we haven't heard from the DNA aspect of this case. It'll probably be on Friday when I'm gone because I'm really interested in that. But I'm curious to see what was on these tools because as of right now, we do not know what caused these. They were long and they were kind of thicker in the middle, but I assume the way she wasn't dismembered in the way that we in prior cases have seen dismemberment. So they also have CT scan photos on the screen. She does this because it helps her visualize the trauma. And some of that sharp trauma was seen on that CT scan. Some of the trauma to the pelvic bone was below the belly button in the pubic region, which is an odd area for dismemberment. And it's just inconsistent with what they normally see when somebody is dismembered. Now, that was the end of the day. And it's one of those things where you know it's bad, but man, sitting in this courtroom now for 15 days, I had no idea how bad it was. I had no idea how bad these bodies were, how bad these kids were treated and discarded. Like Summer said yesterday, like garbage. And I just can't, y'all. It's hurt my heart. It's hurt my heart to see Kay and Larry and Annie and her daughter and the Vallow family and even Lori's family, Summer and her uncle and her cousin. It's been very painful to be in the same room as they're having to hear the worst moments of their loved one's life, the very end, very brutal end. So hopefully this wraps up soon, because I think we now know essentially what happened here. And there's just no words to describe it, y'all. It's terrible. So, all right, guys, I'm out of here. I will talk to you soon. I will not have another episode until Saturday. And I apologize, but I got to take care of my 11-year-old. Seeing Taylor Swift is her dream, and I get to make that happen. So, what a lucky mom I am. All right, guys, I will be live tweeting tomorrow. Kathy Russin from Law and Crime Network is coming into town tonight. We're having a sleepover at my place. She will be live tweeting on Twitter at Law Crime Network. So check her out. She'll pick up the slack for me on Friday. And then I want to know too, when this trial is over, we've covered Letitia Stout since the beginning. Would you guys like for me to go back and do like 2 days for one episode? And I really want to finish that case out. So let me know in the comments if you're interested in me doing Letitia Stout after this, because I've got to find something to do. I am going to take some time off, maybe a week or so once I get back in town, but I am looking for something else to do. So y'all let me know what sounds good to you. We'll do it just like we did Vallow here, and we will just go through the testimony and let you know the best parts. All right, guys, we will see you soon. Hope you have a good rest of your evening. I will see you here on Saturday.